History teaches us that insurmountable obstacles can stop even the greatest armies. Impenetrable fortresses on islands were considered an absolute guarantee of safety in ancient times. The city of Tyre was just such an impregnable stronghold, surrounded by deep waters. The Macedonian army was advancing along the coast after a series of impressive strategic victories. The main goal of this march was to secure complete control over the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Leaving enemy ports behind was a huge strategic risk for supply lines. Tyre remained the last major naval base in the commander's path. This Phoenician city-state consisted of a mainland settlement and a powerful island fortress. The island part seemed completely inaccessible to land forces due to the wide strait. The city's defenders were completely confident in their safety and superiority at sea. Watch the video to the end to find out how an insurmountable sea barrier turned into a paved road for the Macedonian phalanx. Alexander's army arrived on the coast of Phoenicia with a clear plan to subdue all the seaports. The mainland part of the city surrendered without resistance, but the island fortress refused to submit. The Macedonian king could not continue his campaign in Egypt, leaving such a powerful enemy fleet behind him. The island was located about 800 meters from the coastline. The depth of the strait reached 5 meters in some places, making it impossible to cross on foot. The currents in this strait were strong and unpredictable, complicating any navigation. The wall facing the mainland rose to a great height directly from the water. At that time, the Macedonian army did not have its own powerful fleet for an assault from the sea. The defenders of Tyre had dozens of excellent ships and experienced sailors. They could easily intercept any attempts to cross in small boats. The situation seemed hopeless for an army accustomed to winning exclusively on land. Alexander convened a council of his best engineers and military leaders. The decision they made went down in the history of engineering. It was decided not to sail to the island, but to connect it to the mainland. The army had to build a giant embankment right across the strait. Huge resources were needed to implement this colossal project. Soldiers began dismantling buildings in an abandoned mainland city to obtain building stone. Wood was cut in nearby Lebanese forests and delivered to the shore. The entire army turned into one giant construction crew. Work began in the shallow water near the shore, where construction was relatively easy. Stones and earth were dumped into the water, and the edges of the embankment were reinforced with wooden columns. At first, the work progressed quickly, and the dam began to advance steadily toward the island. The soldiers worked methodically day and night, taking turns. Local residents watched in amazement as the sea receded before human will. Macedonian engineers carefully calculated the angle of the embankment so that it would not be washed away by the current. Each new meter required an exponentially greater amount of materials due to the increasing depth. The logistics of delivering stone and wood worked flawlessly. At first, the besieged did not take this idea seriously. They considered it impossible to block such a deep and turbulent strait. Tyrian ships sailed up to the dam under construction, and the sailors simply watched the grandiose construction. However, their attitude soon changed dramatically. As the dam approached the island, construction slowed considerably. The depth increased, and the currents became more aggressive, eroding the edges of the embankment. Engineers had to throw entire trunks of huge trees into the water to create a solid foundation. The Macedonian construction machine faced its first serious test by nature. This stage of the siege demonstrated the incredible organization of supplies and discipline of the Macedonian troops. They methodically performed the most difficult physical work in the name of a strategic goal. Each stone laid brought the land army closer to the impregnable walls. Tyre was a masterpiece of ancient fortification, perfectly integrated into the natural landscape. The island was surrounded by a ring of massive stone walls built of huge hewn blocks. No battering ram of that time could break through such a thick layer of solid stone. The city's architects provided for two well-protected harbors. One was located in the north and was called Sidon, and the other was located in the south and was called Egypt. These harbors were closed by powerful breakwaters and protective chains. Inside the harbors was a powerful military fleet, ready to go to sea at any moment. The walls were designed down to the smallest detail. The stone blocks were joined together without mortar, but so tightly that a blade could not be inserted between them. The upper part of the wall was equipped with special projections to protect archers and slingers. The defenders had an excellent 360-degree view. Inside the city, there were huge reserves of fresh water in deep cisterns. Food warehouses were filled with grain, dried goods, and oil. Tyre was preparing for a long period of autonomous life in complete isolation. The townspeople were confident that they could hold out for many months, or even years. The streets of the city were narrow and winding, which created additional difficulties for any invading army. The houses stood close together, forming a labyrinth of stone. In the center were temples and administrative buildings, from where the defense was managed. The entire structure of the city was subordinated to one goal: maximum security. The island's shape allowed the defenders to quickly transfer forces to any threatened area. Internal communications allowed troops to move around unseen by the besiegers. The fleet constantly patrolled around the island, providing reconnaissance and control over the waters. The Macedonians were opposed by a perfectly tuned defensive machine. The besieged actively used their ships to reconnoiter Macedonian positions on the mainland. They carefully studied the construction of the dam and assessed the pace of progress. The captains of Tyre knew all the peculiarities of local currents and winds. This gave them an undeniable advantage in maneuvering around the embankment. Every morning, smoke rose from the forges and workshops above the island. The city produced new weapons, repaired armor, and prepared projectiles. The engineers of Tyre were also busy developing ways to counter the Macedonian dam. The defensive systems were constantly being improved. The height of the walls facing the dam under construction was further increased. The defenders erected wooden superstructures to rise even higher above the Macedonian engineers. Heavy projectile machines were installed on these platforms for long-range firing. Tyre was preparing to meet the dam with a hail of stones. The fortress seemed completely invulnerable, combining the power of nature with the genius of its builders. The Macedonian embankment slowly but surely approached the firing range of the catapults. The engineers faced the difficult task of protecting their workers. When the dam approached the island, the workers came under constant fire from the walls of Tyre. Construction was paralyzed because people could not remain in open spaces. The Macedonians urgently needed a new engineering solution to protect the builders. The order was given, and a new grandiose construction project began in the rear. Macedonian craftsmen began to assemble 2 giant siege towers from Lebanese cedar. These were colossal wooden structures that towered above the walls of Tyre itself. The towers were to become mobile fortresses directly on the dam under construction. Each tower consisted of many tiers connected by internal staircases. The structure moved on huge wooden rollers along specially laid rails. To protect against incendiary shells, the facade of the towers was covered with wet hides. This was a necessary condition, as wood was extremely vulnerable to fire. The upper tiers of the towers housed the best Macedonian archers and light catapults. Their task was to suppress the firing points on the city walls. The height of the towers allowed the Macedonians to fire from above, which gave them a huge tactical advantage. Now the defenders of Tyre found themselves under fire. The lower tiers were occupied by workers who continued to fill the dam. The towers served as a reliable shield against enemy projectiles. Construction resumed with renewed vigor under the cover of the wooden giants. The dam began to advance inexorably toward the island once again. The towers slowly rolled forward as the embankment lengthened. It was an amazing sight to see these huge mobile structures advancing on the sea. Engineers constantly reinforced the base of the dam to withstand the enormous weight of the wood. The siege turned into a slow but relentless mechanical advance. The defenders of Tyre tried to concentrate their fire on these new targets. They used their heaviest catapults to try to pierce the wooden armor. However, the massive structure of thick cedar logs withstood the powerful blows. Wet hides successfully extinguished attempts to set the towers on fire. Macedonian archers on top of the towers fired continuously at the battlements of the city wall. They forced the Tyrians to hide behind cover and stop firing at the workers below. Firepower superiority in this narrow section passed to the Macedonian army. Engineering genius once again overcame a serious logistical problem. This stage demonstrated the importance of synergy between different branches of the military. Engineers built, infantry moved the towers, archers provided cover. and workers continued to pour stones. The entire Macedonian army acted as a single, coordinated mechanism. Technological superiority began to bear fruit. The appearance of the towers gave the Macedonians back the initiative in this protracted confrontation. The dam became a safe zone from which they could dictate their terms. This unique combination of land tactics and naval engineering went down in the history books. The defenders of Tyre understood that siege towers posed a critical threat to the city. Conventional catapults could not stop these giant wooden structures. Tyrian engineers had to come up with their own technological solution for a counterattack. They took an old cargo ship and turned it into a floating bomb. The ship's hold was filled to the brim with dry branches, resin, sulfur, and other combustible materials. Boilers containing flammable substances were attached to the masts, ready to spill down when the ship tilted. This ship was called a fire ship. Heavy ballast was placed at the stern of the fire ship to raise the bow above the water. This was done so that the bow of the ship could easily catch on the edge of the Macedonian dam. The ship's crew consisted of a few brave men who were ready to abandon ship at the very last moment. The operation required perfect calculation of the wind and currents. Waiting for a favorable wind, the Tyrians took the fire ship out of the harbor and directed it straight at the dam. The ship picked up speed and rapidly approached the siege towers. The Macedonians on the towers saw the approaching threat, but could do nothing. The heavy towers could not be quickly rolled back. The fire ship crashed into the edge of the embankment, and its bow ended up directly under the wooden structures. At that moment, the crew set fire to the combustible mixture and abandoned the ship, sailing away in boats. The fire instantly engulfed the ship, turning it into a huge blazing bonfire. The wind fanned the flames, directing them straight at the facades of the Macedonian towers. The damp skins on the towers began to dry out and smolder from the incredible heat. Soon the flames spread to the wooden structures of the siege engines. The boilers on the masts of the fire ship overturned, pouring additional fuel onto the burning structures. The fire reached catastrophic proportions, engulfing both towers entirely. Macedonian workers and archers were forced to hastily abandon the burning platforms. At the same time, dozens of light boats with armed troops left the harbors of Tyre. They approached the dam from different sides and began to destroy the wooden fortifications of the embankment. The Tyrians methodically destroyed what had been built over several weeks. The defenders pulled out the piles that held the dam together, allowing the sea current to wash away the stones. The fire completely destroyed the pride of Macedonian engineering, turning the towers to ashes. The embankment was seriously damaged, and the siege work was set back many days. It was a brilliant tactical victory for the city's defenders. The command, watching from the shore, realized the depth of the problem. It became clear that without control of the sea, it would be impossible to complete the dam. The Tyrian fleet could repeat a similar attack at any moment. A fundamental change in the strategic approach to the siege was required. The successful counterattack by the Tyrians proved the vulnerability of a purely land-based strategy in maritime conditions. The Macedonian army found itself in a critical situation, having lost its main siege weapons. It was necessary to find a way to neutralize the enemy's superiority on the water. The defeat at the dam forced the Macedonian command to revise the entire campaign plan. Alexander temporarily left the camp at Tyre and headed for other Phoenician cities. The cities of Sidon, Arad, and Byblos, which had previously surrendered to the Macedonians, had significant naval forces. The king demanded that they provide their ships to continue the siege. By this time, news of the military victories had reached all corners of the region. Local rulers understood that resistance was futile and preferred to join the victor. The fleets of the Phoenician cities left their harbors and headed for the assembly point. Soon, the rulers of Cyprus arrived, providing their powerful squadrons. As a result of these diplomatic efforts, a grand fleet was assembled. The armada consisted of more than 200 warships equipped with powerful rams. These were modern triremes and quinqueremes with experienced crews on board. Suddenly, the Macedonian army on land became the owner of the most powerful naval force in the region. Select units of Macedonian infantry boarded the ships. They were to fight on the decks if the Tyrian fleet decided to engage in open combat. Engineers also began installing catapults on some ships. Preparations for the naval phase of the siege were in full swing. The huge Allied fleet set sail and formed a battle line near Tyre. The appearance of hundreds of sails on the horizon came as a complete shock to the island's defenders. Their main advantage vanished in an instant. The siege entered a completely new naval phase. The Tyrian fleet initially left the harbors, ready to engage in battle. However, after assessing the enemy's overwhelming numerical superiority, the admirals of Tyre decided against fighting. They hastily withdrew their ships back behind the protective breakwaters. The entrances to the harbors were tightly blocked by heavy ships lined up side by side. Without firing a single shot, the Allied fleet established complete control over the waters around the island. The ships blocked the northern and southern harbors, preventing the Tyrians from going out to sea. The naval blockade of Tyre became completely impenetrable. The city found itself in complete isolation, deprived of the ability to receive supplies. Now the Macedonian engineers could calmly continue working on the dam. The workers no longer feared sudden attacks from the sea or new fire ships. The construction of the embankment was expanded, and the dam was made much wider than originally planned. The construction of even more siege towers began on the new site. The fleet not only blockaded the city, but also ensured the safe delivery of construction materials. Transport ships brought wood and stone directly to the construction site without hindrance. The logistics chain worked smoothly under the reliable cover of combat triremes. The ring around the island fortress was inexorably tightening. Establishing dominance at sea was a turning point in the entire military campaign. The defenders of Tyre realized that their impregnable island strategy had failed. The Macedonian siege machine worked with redoubled force, using all available resources. The land dam and sea blockade turned the island into a giant trap. It became clear that the dam alone would not be enough to take the city quickly. The thickness of the stone walls on the seaside made a traditional breach virtually impossible. The engineers were tasked with turning warships into floating platforms for siege weapons. It was a bold decision, as the fleet had previously only been used for battles at sea or transporting troops. For this purpose, transport ships were tied together in pairs with strong wooden beams. Heavy and massive battering rams were installed on this wide and stable base. This design turned two ships into a single raft, capable of withstanding enormous weight. This allowed the rams to be brought directly to the stone walls of the city from the open sea. The platform ships slowly approached the island under the reliable cover of leather and wooden shields. These shields protected the rowers and engineers from arrows and incendiary mixtures flying from the walls of Tyre. The Macedonians acted cautiously, trying to get as close as possible to the fortifications. Every meter of progress on the water was extremely difficult due to the weight of the structures. Powerful catapults and long-range ballistas were installed on other ships. They were supposed to fire continuously at the defenders on the walls, covering the work of the heavy battering rams. The use of artillery from the decks of ships was an extremely difficult task due to the constant rocking of the sea waves. Even slight waves could knock the sights off target and send the projectile flying past its target. However, Alexander's talented engineers developed special shock absorption systems to improve firing accuracy. They used additional mountings and mats to dampen recoil and stabilize the guns. Thanks to this, the Macedonians managed to establish accurate fire on the battlements of the Tyrian walls. It became increasingly difficult for the city's defenders to take up open positions for defense. The defenders of Tyre were not going to give up and responded with their own engineering ingenuity. They began dropping huge stone blocks from the walls directly into the sea onto the shallow coastal waters. These underwater obstacles created artificial reefs that prevented Macedonian ships from approaching the walls. Floating siege platforms ran into these invisible barriers and got stuck, becoming easy targets. The Macedonians had to develop and build special crane mechanisms installed directly on the ships. These crane ships sailed up to the barriers, hooked the huge stones with strong ropes and winches, and dragged them to the depths. It was exhausting and painstaking work that had to be carried out under constant fire. Each cleared area provided a long-awaited opportunity to move the heavy battering rams even closer to their target. The Tyrians tried to prevent the clearing of the bottom by approaching the Macedonian fleet in small, stealthy boats. They dived into the water unnoticed and cut the anchor ropes of enemy ships with sharp knives. Without anchors, the heavy ships lost control and were carried by the current straight onto the coastal rocks. In response, the the Macedonians showed ingenuity and replaced the usual ropes with thick metal chains. Now, it was absolutely impossible to cut the fastenings underwater, and the ships were securely fixed in the desired positions. The siege finally turned into a methodical and cruel competition between engineers and mechanics on both sides. The Macedonian fleet slowly, literally meter by meter, cleared the sea approaches to the impregnable city wall. Floating rams began to deliver the first powerful blows to the ancient stone masonry of the great island. For the first time in their centuries-long history, the walls of Tyre began to visibly shake from these blows. The defenders used special devices with loops to capture the massive heads of the rams. They threw iron hooks from above, trying to hook and break the beams of the enemy siege engines. The Macedonian crews repelled these daring attacks, using very long pikes directly from the decks of their ships. The confrontation was fought for every centimeter of masonry, and no one wanted to retreat. The combined attack from the dam under construction and from the sea greatly stretched the defenders' small forces. The Tyrians had to constantly move their best troops from one dangerous area to another. The tension inside the besieged city grew with each new day of this continuous and fierce assault. The stone blocks of the walls began to show the first deep cracks under the methodical blows of steel tips. The innovative use of the fleet as a carrier of heavy machinery was an unprecedented military solution at the time. The entire water area around Tyre turned into one huge and active zone of attack. The sea walls, which for centuries had been considered completely invulnerable, began to gradually and inevitably collapse. At the same time, the giant dam finally reached the base of the walls of the great island fortress. A wide road, paved with stone and reinforced with earth, now connected Tyre to the mainland forever. Even more massive and taller siege towers were moved closer to the city, along this new artificial land. The embankment was literally bristling with dozens of catapults, which were aimed directly at the main city fortifications. A grandiose and destructive artillery duel began between the advancing army and the guards locked in the fortress. The air above the strait was filled with the constant hum of flying stones and the whistling of huge metal arrows. The Macedonians' heavy catapults methodically destroyed the defensive battlements on the walls, depriving the Tyrians of any reliable cover. Ballistas knocked out enemy embrasures with high accuracy and destroyed the defenders' return fire points. The defenders of the city used all means at their disposal to desperately resist the assault. They dropped baskets of hot sand on the attackers' heads, which easily penetrated any armor. This fine sand caused unbearable burns, forcing the warriors to drop their shields and leave the battlefield. Huge vessels of boiling oil and powerful incendiary shells were also used. The entire area around the edge of the dam turned into a zone of continuous fire, screams, and complete chaos. Macedonian workers, shielding themselves with heavy wooden shields, began to bring the main battering rams to the mainland wall. The blows of massive logs with iron tips echoed throughout the streets of the besieged island. However, the ancient builders of Tyre had constructed this particular part of the fortifications with incredible, colossal strength. The stones at the base of the mainland wall were the largest, and the masonry itself was the thickest in the entire city. Despite all the titanic efforts of Alexander's land army, it was impossible to break through this wall on the first try. The battering rams only chipped away at the outer layers of stone, but could not penetrate the depths of this monolithic and ancient defense. The engineers soon realized that the decisive breakthrough would have to come not from land, but from the sea. The dam had fully fulfilled its important role, drawing the most significant forces and attention of the defenders. Now the attention of the Macedonian army command was completely focused on the work of the floating siege engines and the fleet. Ships equipped with battering rams began to methodically probe every meter of the walls of Tyre in search of the weakest spot. One such vulnerable spot was finally discovered on the southern section of the city's fortress wall. The stonework in this sector proved to be less resistant to constant vibrations and directed blows. All available floating siege engines were immediately concentrated on this small section. The battering rams worked in sync, rhythmically and powerfully striking the same selected point on the wall. The defenders panicked and tried to reinforce this spot from the inside, quickly erecting additional supports and barricades. but the massive and precise blows from the sea relentlessly did their destructive work, crushing the ancient stone. At the same time, the Macedonian fleet carried out demonstrative and false maneuvers near the closed city harbors. This forced the Tyrians to keep a significant part of their troops in reserve to defend their ports. The island's defenses were stretched to the limit, and the defenders' forces began to rapidly dwindle under such pressure. The continuous and heavy strain of the months-long siege exhausted the entire garrison of Tyre, both physically and morally. A sophisticated system of signal flags allowed the Macedonians to perfectly synchronize attacks from all possible directions. The city was subjected to simultaneous and incredibly powerful pressure from all sides, both land and sea. No fortress in the ancient world had ever been subjected to such a complex and coordinated attack before. The overall organization of troop management and engineering work in Alexander's army was at the highest historical level. The cracks in the southern section of the wall grew larger and wider with each passing minute, foreshadowing imminent disaster. Huge stone blocks began to fall out of the masonry and crash into the sea below. The engineers on the ships increased the frequency of their attacks, realizing that the long-awaited outcome was very close. The fortress, which had stood proudly for centuries and was considered completely impregnable, was now preparing to fall under the onslaught of human perseverance. Finally, after many days of continuous and exhausting blows, the southern wall of the city could not withstand the enormous pressure. A huge section of ancient masonry collapsed with a deafening roar straight into the sea. A wide and deep breach had finally formed in the defensive perimeter of the once impregnable Tyre. This breach instantly became the main and only target for the entire upcoming general assault. The Macedonian command immediately gave the order to pull the heavy ships with battering rams back a little. In their place, special ships carrying selected assault troops were rapidly brought forward. These ships were equipped in advance with long and sturdy folding bridges for landing. The bridges were to be lowered with a bang directly onto the sharp debris of the destroyed wall, opening the way for the infantry to enter the city. A detailed and carefully planned final coordinated attack on the fortress was developed. The assault on the main breach was to be accompanied by a series of diversionary strikes in all available directions. The entire Allied fleet received strict orders to attack both harbors of the city simultaneously and without delay. Ground forces on the artificial dam were to simulate a massive assault on the powerful mainland wall. The defenders of Tyre understood perfectly well where the most important and dangerous blow would be struck. They hastily pulled all their remaining reserves to the southern breach and erected strong improvised barricades there. The desperate townspeople armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find, sincerely prepared to defend their homes to the very end. The last defenders of the great city lined up in a dense and formidable row near the ruined wall. Commander Alexander personally led one of the first assault troops on fast ships. Right next to him was his personal elite guard, heavily armed and experienced hypaspists. The presence of the legendary commander on the front line greatly boosted the morale of all Macedonian soldiers. A powerful signal to begin the general assault was given simultaneously to all army and navy units. Distracting maneuvers and attacks began precisely according to a predetermined and strict schedule. Powerful catapults from a high dam rained heavy stones down on the defenders' heads, preventing them from looking up. Allied ships attempted to break through the massive chains that securely closed the entrances to the city harbors. The Tyrians had to hastily divide their attention, which significantly weakened their defenses on the main line of attack. Assault ships rowed swiftly and confidently toward a wide breach in the damaged southern wall. Folding wooden bridges clattered down onto the stones, creating convenient makeshift ramps for the warriors. The Macedonian heavy infantry rushed forward fiercely, straight at the sharp spears of Tyre's last defenders. An extremely difficult and bloody close combat began in the narrow and debris-filled space of the breach. The hypaspist units, using their many years of experience and excellent equipment, methodically pushed through the ranks of the defenders. The besieged fought with incredible tenacity and courage, knowing full well that they had nowhere else to retreat. The fragile barricades changed hands several times during this fierce assault. However, the Macedonians, constantly supported by fresh reinforcements from arriving ships, continued their relentless advance. The commander was the first to resolutely climb to the top of the ruined wall, inspiring all the other soldiers with his example. His sudden appearance at the top caused real horror and confusion among the ranks of the exhausted Tyrian defenders. The Macedonian phalanxes began to rapidly expand their captured foothold, pushing the defenders deeper into the island. The organized defense of the breach was finally and irrevocably broken by the onslaught of Alexander's army. The breach in the southern section of the wall marked the official beginning of the end for the great Phoenician city-state. Soldiers poured into the narrow streets of the city, quickly suppressing any scattered resistance from the defenders. The perfect and complex fortification system collapsed due to a critical breach at just one single point. The city, which for centuries had been considered completely impregnable, was finally open to the harsh victors. While the main infantry forces broke through the southern breach, the Allied fleet also achieved its objectives. The Cypriot ships managed with great difficulty to break through the heavy barrier chains at the entrance to the northern Sidon harbor. They stormed into the port and landed the first assault force directly on the docks in the northern part of the city. The harbor's defenses instantly collapsed under the powerful onslaught of the superior forces of the entire Macedonian fleet. At the same time, the Phoenician ships of the Allies broke through to the southern, so-called Egyptian harbor. The Tyrian warships, trapped inside the harbor, were quickly boarded or pushed tightly against the shore. Macedonian sailors landed on shore and dealt a crushing blow to the rear of the troops still defending the walls. The deadly ring of encirclement began to rapidly tighten within the city quarters of the island itself. Fierce street fighting continued in all possible directions within the ancient Phoenician polis. The Tyrians slowly retreated to the very center of the city, using the flat roofs of houses to fire on the advancing Macedonian columns. However, any organized resistance was already practically impossible due to the rapid advance of the heavy infantry. The narrow and confusing streets did not allow the defenders to form a dense and reliable defensive formation. Most of the townspeople and local nobility took refuge in the world-famous temple of Melkart. They sincerely hoped for the sanctity of this place and the protection of the strong walls of the ancient sanctuary. Alexander personally ordered his soldiers not to touch those who had found temporary safe haven there. The king of Tyre and the city's top officials also officially surrendered to the mercy of the great victor. The city's political leadership capitulated completely, acknowledging their defeat in this long and exhausting war. Macedonian troops quickly took full control of all key and strategic points of the captured city. Arsenal warehouses, port facilities, and important administrative buildings were immediately occupied by soldiers. Resistance in residential areas gradually died down, and the silence of a defeated land reigned over the city. After 7 long months of incredible tension and hard work, the siege was officially declared over. The capture of Tyre was the most important strategic victory in Alexander's entire large-scale eastern military campaign. The main threat to the army's rear was eliminated forever, giving the Macedonians absolute control of the sea. The Persian fleet instantly lost its best and most reliable base in the entire Mediterranean. The entire further path of the great Macedonian army to rich Egypt was now completely open and absolutely safe. The artificial dam, built with the colossal efforts of thousands of people, forever changed the familiar geography of this ancient place. The island turned into a peninsula, firmly connected to the mainland by a wide and reliable sandy isthmus. Over time, sea currents washed even more sand around the rocks, forming a wide strip of land. This unique geological change in the landscape has been preserved in its original form to this day. The siege of Tyre clearly demonstrated to the whole world the unprecedented level of ancient engineering thought at that time. It was proven in practice that there are no insurmountable natural barriers for a persistent and disciplined army. The most advanced construction technologies, logistics, and coordination of troops made it possible to accomplish this seemingly impossible task. This valuable experience became a benchmark and textbook for many subsequent generations of military engineers and architects. The use of combined land and sea forces anticipated many modern concepts in military science. Alexander's floating siege platforms became the first historical prototype of the future powerful naval artillery. The flexibility of the high command, which was able to change its plans on the fly, ensured this grand final success. The technological and scientific approach to warfare fully justified itself in the conditions of the most difficult assault on an island fortress. The city, which for many millennia had relied on its natural isolation, was finally subjugated by human will. Tyre lost its former independence forever, becoming only a small part of the vast and expanding Macedonian Empire. The fall of this world-famous fortress became a vivid symbol of the dawn of a new, great historical era. The geopolitical consequences of the fall of Tyre were truly momentous for the entire ancient world. News of the capture of the island fortress, which had been considered impregnable, spread like wildfire throughout the Mediterranean coast. Other cities and small states instantly realized that open resistance to this army was now completely futile. The morale of all potential opponents was finally broken by such a demonstration of incredible engineering and military power. Control of the entire Phoenician coast completely deprived the Persian king and his allies of access to the open sea. The Macedonians did not waste years fighting naval battles with the enemy fleet directly on the water. Instead, they methodically destroyed all of its main supply bases on land. This ingenious and unconventional strategy allowed the land army to effectively win the naval war without a single major battle between the fleets. All the logistical lines and supply routes of the Macedonian army were now completely safe from naval raids. The rich and prosperous city of Tyre was quickly integrated into the new economic system of the expanding empire. Its huge port facilities were actively used to transport new troops and actively develop trade. The city's enormous wealth replenished the treasury, allowing the military campaign to the east to continue. Experienced engineers and skilled craftsmen of ancient Phoenicia began to work for the victor's military machine. Technological and cultural exchange between distant regions of Greece and the east reached a whole new level. The dam, left after the end of the long siege, became an eternal monument to human perseverance and genius. It clearly showed how the determination of one person can change the face of an entire planet. Over many decades and centuries, sea currents deposited sand on the powerful stone foundation of this embankment. Gradually, the artificial isthmus expanded, turning the land bridge into a full-fledged strip of land. Over time, the Great Tyre became an ordinary coastal city, forever losing its unique status as an island. Nature was effectively forced to submit to the monumental engineering design of the ancient builders. The unique experience of using huge floating siege towers and the first naval artillery became the advanced military standard. All naval tactics of that time were enriched with new and extremely effective techniques for storming coastal fortifications. Subsequent commanders of the Great Hellenistic era actively used these developments in their future campaigns. The art of siege warfare confidently and permanently crossed the boundary between land and sea. The successful capture of Tyre clearly demonstrated to everyone that the success of any operation depends not only on the bravery of soldiers. The command's ability to organize the smooth and accurate delivery of thousands of tons of building materials decided the outcome of this long battle. The Macedonian army demonstrated to the world its unique administrative and organizational efficiency. Competent management of resources and people was the main guarantee of this resounding and legendary victory. Alexander's army command showed itself at its best, not only on the battlefield, but also in military administration. The efforts of dozens of different allied fleets were successfully combined and directed towards a single goal. The precise coordination of such diverse forces was the decisive factor in the rapid breakthrough of the powerful defenses. This triumph finally cemented the Macedonians' reputation as the most advanced and invincible force of their time. The heroic defense of the inhabitants of Tyre also deserves the highest praise and respect from all military historians. The townspeople demonstrated incredible ingenuity in creating sophisticated counter-battery weapons and dangerous fire ships. Their steadfast and fierce resistance delayed the advance of the huge Macedonian army for 7 long months. It was an uncompromising and fair battle between two opponents who were absolutely equal in their intelligence and tenacity. This famous siege forever erased all the usual boundaries of the impossible in ancient warfare. A combination of subtle diplomacy, precise engineering calculations, determination, and iron discipline helped overcome any obstacles. The story of the fall of Tyre teaches us that absolutely any wall can be overcome if the right tool is found. And this important tool is not always made of hard steel, because sometimes it is cold and precise calculation. The Siege of Tyre will forever remain in history as one of the greatest military engineering operations. It demonstrated the indisputable victory of intellect over natural landscape and architectural power. The memory of this event has survived for millennia, reminding us of the grand scale of ancient thought. The Siege of Tyre is not just a story about destroyed walls. It is a story about how a bold idea can change geography itself. Macedonian engineers proved that human genius is capable of turning the sea into land in order to achieve its goal. This historical episode clearly demonstrates how unconventional thinking breaks any established stereotypes of warfare.